In 1986, a 26-year-old Anita Kobe was kidnapped while walking home from a Blacktown railway in a Sydney, Australia suburb. She was subsequently tortured and sexually assaulted. 2 days later, Kobe's lifeless body was discovered on a nearby farm. Police determined that she had sustained multiple knife wounds and lacerations from barbed wire, and she died as a result of a slit throat. The case quickly garnered publicity throughout the entire country of Australia and put immense pressure on the law enforcement to solve this senseless murder and bring the perpetrators to justice. Nobody could have guessed who in their right mind would do something like that in a relatively peaceful and crime-free community. In this video, we are gonna look closer at the gruesome murder of the young woman, a woman who had an entire life ahead of her, in a case that truly shocked Australia to the core. And in the process, we'll also learn who was ultimately responsible, how they were caught, and what punishment they received. Anita Lynch Kobe was born in Sydney, Australia on November 2nd, 1959, to Gary Bernard Lynch, a graphic artist with the Royal Australian Air Force, and Grace Peggy Lynch, a nurse. As a teenager, she participated in numerous beauty pageants, including winning the Miss Western Suburbs pageant in November 1979. That paved the way to a promising career as a model. However, she decided instead to follow in her mother's footsteps and also become a nurse. She met her future husband, John Kobe, while studying for her nursing degree at Sydney Hospital. They married on March 27, 1982. Few years later, the young couple decided to put their relationship on hold and temporarily separate. She then moved in with her parents in Blacktown, a suburb of Sydney. According to John Kobe, at the time of her murder, he and Anita were on good terms and had even been planning to get back together and have kids. In 1986, Kobe was working in Sydney and commuted daily from her home in the nearby Blacktown. On February 2nd, she finished work at Sydney Hospital at 3 p.m. and met friends for dinner in nearby Redfern. That evening, at 9:12 p.m., Kobe caught a train from Central Railway Station to the Blacktown station. Arriving at Blacktown, she would usually ring her father, who would pick her up. At least that was the plan, except that evening would be very different. When she walked out of the train station, she noticed there were no taxis outside waiting for passengers. Since this was well before the existence of mobile phones, and because the only public phone at the station had been vandalized and was out of order, Kobe had no other option than to walk home. As Kobe made the fateful decision to walk in the direction of her house, she had no idea the kind of terror that awaited her just down the road. At around 10 p.m., as Kobe was walking alone from the station along Newton Road, a gang of 5 men drove up beside her and stopped their stolen white HT Holden Kingswood. Two of them jumped out, grabbed Kobe, and began to force her into the car. Kobe vehemently refused, fighting off the attackers, but they easily overpowered her and dragged her, kicking and screaming, into the car. Once inside the car, Kobe was ordered to strip off her clothes. She refused and begged her attackers to let her go. She explained that she was married and was also menstruating. Unfortunately, none of that would deter her attackers. They repeatedly punched Kobe, breaking her nose and both cheekbones. They then drove her to a service station to purchase fuel, using money stolen from Kobe's purse. Kobe was then driven down Reen Road to a secluded paddock and, while being held down in the car, was repeatedly sexually assaulted and continually beaten by the 5 attackers. They then dragged the brutally beaten Kobe into the paddock along a barbed wire fence. There, they dumped her and continued to sexually and physically abuse her for some time. Initially, killing their victim was never part of the plan, but as one of the attackers, John Travers, stated later in his taped confession, they became concerned that Kobe would identify them because she had seen their faces and heard their names. He convinced the other attackers that they needed to kill her. Urged on by the others, Travers slit her throat, almost severing her head. Her bloodied, naked body was left in a secluded cow paddock at Prospect, not far from Blacktown. It wouldn't be discovered for another 2 days. As this was happening, a 16-year-old boy, his younger sister, and their mother heard someone screaming from their house directly opposite and had gone outside in time to see Kobe forced into the attacker's car. The boy ran across the road to help, but the car drove off before he reached it. Returning home, he telephoned the police to report what he had seen. A few minutes later, their neighbor and his girlfriend arrived home and, after being told of the abduction, drove off to search for the car. They eventually drove down Reen Road in Prospect and stopped by the now empty Holden, where the man used a flashlight to search the adjacent paddock. Seeing nothing in the paddock and believing the car he was looking for was a different model Holden, he returned home. The attackers later stated that they had hidden in the long grass to avoid the flashlight and waited for the man to leave. According to the medical examiner's report, Kobe's body showed extensive bruising on her head, breasts, face, shoulders, groin, thighs, and legs, consistent with a systematic beating, including a blow of considerable force around the right eye. She also had lacerations on her hips, thighs, and legs from the barbed wire. Several cuts to her neck, resulting in the severing of her ear and windpipe, and near decapitation, with many cuts to her hands and fingers, resulting in the near severing of 3 of her fingers, which likely occurred when she raised her hands to her face, trying to protect herself from the knife. When Kobe did not return home, her family initially thought she was staying overnight with a friend, but after learning that she failed to appear at work the next day, they reported her missing on February 3rd. The following morning, on February 4th, her naked body was found in the paddock by a farmer investigating what his cows were milling about. Kobe's body was initially identified by her distinctive wedding ring, which was still on her finger when she was found. Initially, the police suspected her estranged husband John to be connected to the murder. However, after talking to him, they realized he had no role whatsoever, and he was quickly cleared. The Australian public reacted with anger upon hearing details of Kobe's murder. On February 6th, the NSW state government posted a $50,000 reward for information leading to the capture of Kobe's killers. Also on that same day, morning radio host John Laws obtained a leaked copy of Kobe's autopsy report, which contained explicit details of her injuries, and read it live on the air, which further shocked and galvanized the already enraged public. Later on, in a 2016 interview with Australia's Channel 7 News, Laws would go on to say that he did it because he felt that the general public ought to know, and that it incited anger in the public that murders like this were happening and we weren't being given the full details. At this point, the police still had no idea who was responsible. They had no leads nor suspects, so they came up with a plan. A few days later, on February 9th, police reenacted Kobe's movements on the night of her disappearance in the hope of jogging the memories of travelers or others who might have seen her. Constable Debbie Wallace wore similar clothing to Kobe and traveled the 9:12 p.m. train to Blacktown. Detectives interviewed the passengers and showed them photos of Kobe, while Constable Wallace walked the length of the train during the journey. Unfortunately, that did not yield any leads whatsoever. But shortly after, the police would get the break they were waiting for. Following a tip-off from a police informant regarding the stolen Holden car, police started searching for Travers, Michael Murdoch, and brothers Les, Michael, and Gary Murphy after they discovered that some of them had a history of violence and that Travers had a reputation for carrying a knife. On February 21st, police arrested Travers and Murdoch at the home of Travers' uncle and Les Murphy at Travers' own house. While they couldn't yet be charged with Kobe's murder, Murdoch and Murphy were charged with offenses relating to stolen cars and released on bail. Travers, who admitted that he had stolen a car, made conflicting statements about the murder and was detained in police custody. While in custody, he requested that a friend be called so she could bring him cigarettes. The phone number was handed to the investigating police officer, who contacted the friend, a woman. The woman, Travers' aunt, eventually dubbed Miss X, agreed to help with the investigation. She met with an officer and gave him details of Travers' background. Miss X was subsequently sent back in to talk to Travers, agreeing to hide a recording microphone device in her bra while she visited him in his cell and was able to obtain a confession. Later, Miss X went to Murdoch's home while wearing the concealed recording device to capture his statements on tape as well. Eventually, all 5 men were arrested and charged with the murder. Police were undoubtedly praised for their quick response in capturing all the suspects involved. All in all, it had taken the police just over 3 weeks to find the suspects, charge them in the murder of Anita Kobe, and take them into custody. The 5 suspects were John Travers, Michael Murdoch, and the Murphy brothers, consisting of Michael, Gary, and Les. Taken together, they had over 50 prior convictions for offenses including armed robbery, assault, larceny, car theft, breaking and entering, drug use, escaping lawful custody, receiving stolen goods, and rape. John Raymond Travers, considered the ringleader of the gang, was raised in poverty in Blacktown and was the oldest of 8 children from an unmarried teenage parents. By age 14, he was already an alcoholic and was expelled from high school during year 10 for being continually disruptive to other students. Beyond schooling, Travers held few jobs and relied mostly on unemployment benefits as a source of income. He was eventually committed to Boys Town, a juvenile detention facility, by his mother. His father, with whom he never shared a close relationship, left the household in 1981. Finding it difficult to support the family, Travers relied on crime to provide food, stealing animals such as chickens and ducks from nearby households. The health of Travers' mother eventually deteriorated, and he and his siblings were sent to live with foster families while she was hospitalized. Travers had a history of violent sexual behavior and bestiality. Witnesses have recounted that on several occasions he had bought a live sheep for a barbecue and slit the animal's throat as he sodomized it before roasting its carcass on a spit. Michael Murdoch was a childhood friend and criminal associate of Travers. He had also spent a great part of his childhood in juvenile prisons where he experienced sexual assaults. Michael, Gary, and Les Murphy, the 3 brothers from a family of 9 children, were also accused of the gruesome crime. Michael Murphy, aged 33, was the eldest of the 9 Murphy children. He was sent to live with his grandmother when he was just 12 years of age. Gary Murphy, aged 28. A hearing impairment affected Gary's schooling, and he left early to seek work. He was noted as being an able and willing worker before the crimes. Gary's strong interest in cars led him to facing several car theft-related charges in the years preceding the murder. He was known to have a very violent temper. Les Murphy, aged 22, was the youngest of the Murphy children and was known as having the worst temperament. He had faced children's court on many occasions for a number of theft-related offenses before being accused of the Kobe's murder. The trial of the 5 began in Sydney on March 16, 1987. Before proceedings began, Travers changed his plea to guilty. Sydney newspaper The Sun published a front-page story on the day the trial began, carrying the headline, "Anita Murder, Man Guilty," along a large image of Travers. The news story also referred to Michael Murphy as an unemployed prison escapee with no fixed address and another in the same paper detailed Murphy's criminal convictions and his recent escape from Silverwater Correctional Center, where he was serving a 25-year sentence for a string of burglaries and thefts. The medical examiner later testified that after Kobe's throat was cut, she would have died within 2 minutes. He also testified that some news reports, allegedly based on his own report, contained misinformation about the type and extent of Kobe's injuries. She was not mutilated. Apart from the slashing of her throat and hands, there had been no attack with a knife on her stomach or genitals, and her shoulders had not been dislocated. The trial for the remaining members of the gang lasted 54 days, with the men's defense relying on convincing the jury of their minimal involvement in the beating and murder. The defense's main argument was that, since the person who committed the murder was John Travers, and since the others did not want to kill her and even tried to talk him out of it, they were not guilty. Fortunately, the prosecution was able to squash that argument by bringing in an example of a bank robber and a getaway driver. Even if the bank robber alone enters the bank and shoots someone, the shooter and the getaway driver are both responsible, because they were working as a team and should both take the blame for the ensuing crime. The jury agreed. On June 10, 1987, all 5 were found guilty of sexual assault and murder. On June 16th, they were each sentenced in the Supreme Court of New South Wales to life imprisonment plus additional time without the possibility of parole. Presiding Justice Alan Maxwell described the crime as, quote, one of the most horrifying physical and sexual assaults. This was a calculated killing done in cold blood. The executive should grant the same degree of mercy they bestowed on their victim. End of quote. Many years later, Kobe's parents would join forces with Christine and Peter Simpson, the parents of murder victim Ebony Simpson, a young girl who was also abducted and murdered, to create the Homicide Victims Support Group, a community support group that helps families deal with heinous crimes. They also campaigned for tougher sentencing and truth in sentencing laws. Kobe's father, Gary Lynch, died on September 14, 2008, aged 90, after suffering from Alzheimer's disease. Her mother, Grace, died of lung cancer in 2013 at the age of 88. The Lynches had been married for 54 years at the time of Gary's death. As for her killers, Michael Murphy died on February 21, 2019, at the age of 66 after a long battle with terminal cancer. At the time of filming of this video, the 4 other offenders are still alive and are still serving their life sentences in various maximum security correctional centers across New South Wales. Although, for security reasons, it is not known where exactly they're being housed. Although justice had been rightfully served, unfortunately nothing could ever be done to bring back Anita Kobe, the always smiling and radiating young woman who would always light up the room. According to her family and friends, she had a very bright future ahead of her, one that was unfortunately prematurely ended by a pathetic gang of lowlifes.